9 hours separated Pearl Harbor from the blow that landed on Clark Field. That should have been enough time to pull aircraft apart, keep them moving, and treat the first reports from Hawaii as the opening of a wider war. Instead, when Japanese bombers reached Luzon on December 8, 1941, American aircraft were still dangerously exposed on the ground. The warning did arrive. The difficulty lay in what happened after it arrived, as it passed through Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, through Richard Sutherland, and toward Louis Brereton's Far East Air Force. Some details of responsibility have been argued over for decades. The consequence has not. On the first day of the war in the Philippines, American air power was crippled before the campaign on land had properly begun. The calendar had already turned to December 8th in the Philippines when news of Pearl Harbor began to move across the Pacific. That mattered. The attack in Hawaii was not a local emergency that Manila could observe from a distance. It was proof that Japan had opened war against the United States, and official U.S. histories placed the strike on Clark Field about 9 hours after Pearl Harbor. At the center of the American command structure stood General Douglas MacArthur, commanding U.S. Army forces in the Far East. Under him was Major General Louis H. Brereton, commander of the Far East Air Force. Between them stood Major General Richard K. Sutherland, MacArthur's chief of staff, a man whose position gave him great influence over access, tempo, and the practical flow of decisions. The first warning created an immediate military problem. If war had begun, the Air Force on Luzon could not behave as though it were still in peacetime routine. Aircraft might need to be dispersed. Crews had to be alerted. Runways, fuel, and readiness suddenly became questions of hours, then minutes. A principal base such as Clark Field, crowded with valuable aircraft, was useful only as long as the enemy had not yet found it. Official records are clear on one basic point. The warning did reach MacArthur's headquarters through a chain involving Sutherland and Brereton. That is enough to rule out the simplest explanation, the comforting one that no one knew in time. They did know in time that war had started. What remains difficult is establishing exactly how that knowledge became orders, how quickly those orders moved, and how much freedom Brereton had to act without fresh approval from above. It is at this point that uncertainty arises. Brereton's name featured prominently in accounts and descriptions of that day because he was the commander of the Air Force slated to bear the brunt of the attack. The high command backed MacArthur, while Sutherland acted as the intermediary in the chain of command. Thus, the warning passed through the actual offices of actual people, through a headquarters that suddenly had to shift from a state of anticipation to combat readiness. By the time Japanese aircraft came for Luzon, the Americans had not been surprised in the same way as Pearl Harbor. They had been warned. That is what makes the events at Clark Field so hard to dismiss as mere bad luck. It is tempting to imagine that once Pearl Harbor was known, every aircraft in the Philippines should have been airborne or hidden within an hour. Real air forces do not move so cleanly. They depend on fuel, maintenance, communications, runway space, and a command system willing to accept risk. An aircraft on patrol cannot be refueled at the same moment. An aircraft dispersed away from a main base may be safer from bombers, but less easy to service, arm, or control. Still, those practical limits do not remove the central problem. Clark Field was a principal American air base, and official histories describe it as badly hit, with aircraft on the ground left dangerously exposed. The issue is not whether dispersal was perfect or easy. The issue is why so much value remained concentrated after the warning had arrived. Part of the answer seems to lie in headquarters control. Brereton was the air commander, but the evidence also shows him operating within a chain in which MacArthur's approval mattered and Sutherland controlled access to it. That arrangement may have made sense in peacetime or during planning. On the first morning of a Pacific War, it risked turning speed into hesitation. This is where the historical argument grows sharper. Some later accounts put heavy blame on MacArthur personally. Others stress confusion, fragmented communications, and the shock of the first hours after Pearl Harbor. The safest conclusion from the official record is narrower, but still severe. The warning was understood as real. The headquarters had time measured in hours rather than minutes. And yet, the Air Force was not placed in a condition that protected it from what followed. That failure did not require one dramatic refusal or one lost telephone message. Bureaucracies often fail more quietly. A request waits for approval. A subordinate hesitates to exceed his authority. A chief of staff filters what reaches the commander and when. Meanwhile, aircraft are landed, serviced, rearmed, and gathered in patterns that make administrative sense on an airfield and military sense only if the enemy does not arrive. On Luzon, the enemy did arrive. By then, the difference between warning and readiness had become painfully concrete. The Americans had recognized that war had started. They had not transformed that recognition into enough movement, enough dispersal, or enough protection at their main airfields. The gap was not abstract. It sat on runways and aprons in full view from the air. When the Japanese strike reached Clark Field, the consequences were immediate. Official U.S. histories describe the base as one of the principal targets of the attack on the Philippines. They also describe the result in blunt terms. Heavy bombers were destroyed there, and fighters were caught while still preparing to take off. That detail matters because it strips away later excuses. Aircraft lost in the air can be explained by tactical inferiority, weather, or combat fortune. Aircraft destroyed while lined up, refueling, or waiting to launch tell a different story. They point back to the morning's unfinished decisions. Clark was not just another strip on Luzon. It was one of the key American air bases in the islands. Damage there meant more than wrecked machines on a runway. It reduced reconnaissance, interception, and the ability to strike back. The Japanese attack, according to official histories, seriously crippled American air power in the Philippines at the outset of the campaign. The scale of the loss has often been summarized in a stark phrase. The Far East Air Force lost fully half its planes on the first day of the war. That wording appears in official American historical material, and it captures why Clark Field entered the larger story of 1941 almost as a second shock after Pearl Harbor. In the space of one day, the United States had been hit in Hawaii and then struck again in the Western Pacific in a way that sharply narrowed what its commanders in the Philippines could still do. A National Archives account goes further in one specific location, stating that nearly 50% of the American warplanes at Clark Field were destroyed. Even allowing for differences between theater-wide losses and losses at a single base, the broad point stands securely. A very large share of the available air strength was lost almost at once. What followed on the ground was not simply the tallying of wreckage, it was the collapse of assumptions. Air cover could no longer be taken for granted. A commander planning to contest landings or protect movement across Luzon had fewer tools than he had expected that morning. The campaign in the Philippines would continue, but it would do so under a sky that the Americans were far less able to control. This is why Clark Field mattered beyond its own perimeter fence. It marked the moment when American air power in the islands ceased to be a serious shield and became instead a damaged remnant trying to survive the opening phase of a much larger offensive. Responsibility for Clark Field has never settled into a neat verdict. That is partly because the crucial hours ran through a headquarters structure in which authority and access were not the same thing. MacArthur commanded everything. Brereton commanded the air arm. Sutherland stood in the channel between them. Once the bombing ended, each role could be described clearly on paper. During the morning itself, the practical relationship between those roles was the problem. It is reasonable to say that MacArthur's headquarters failed. The evidence supports that much. War had begun. A warning had reached the command structure. Clark Field remained vulnerable, and the Far East Air Force suffered crippling losses on the first day. It is harder to assign the exact weight of blame among the three principal figures without moving beyond what the safest sources will bear. Did MacArthur personally delay too long? Did Sutherland slow the process at a critical moment? Did Brereton lack freedom to act, or did he still retain room to do more? Historians have argued over those questions for decades, and some details remain contested. But the broad outline no longer needs embellishment. This was not a case in which the Philippines were struck before anyone could possibly react. Nor was it a case in which one garbled signal alone doomed the defense. The warning existed. The command system received it. The response failed to protect a principal air base from the kind of attack that should have been expected next. That is the contradiction at the heart of December 8, 1941, in the Philippines. The Americans were not blind, yet they were still caught exposed. They had hours, yet those hours did not produce security. In war, information can travel quickly and still arrive too late in practical terms if authority is congested, if decisions wait for the wrong desk, or if institutions are not ready to move at the pace of events. Clark Field was the price of that gap. Pearl Harbor has always overshadowed what happened later that same day in the Philippines. Yet Clark Field deserves attention for a different reason. It shows how a warning can be accurate, urgent, and still operationally wasted. The Japanese attack did not expose a failure to receive news. It exposed a failure to convert news into protection. That distinction matters because it reaches far beyond December 1941. Armies often believe that being informed is the same as being prepared. At Clark Field, it was not. The reports had arrived. The chain of command was in place. The aircraft were still there when the bombers came. 9 hours sounded like time. It was not enough, or rather, it was not used well enough. And by the end of December 8th, half of the Far East Air Force was gone. Subscribe to discover how one decision changed the course of history.